I knew a fair bit of it, mainly because she came back with all these stories and full of excitement and just passion for what she'd been doing.
A hidden letter written by Princess Diana has just been pulled from a sealed Windsor archive, untouched for nearly 3 decades. The wax seal was still intact. William had never seen it, and when he finally read what his mother wrote, the people still living inside that palace had every reason to be terrified. The archive that was never meant to be opened. Nobody was supposed to find it. That is the detail that keeps surfacing every time someone close to this story speaks about what happened inside Windsor Castle in the early weeks of 2026. Not that the letter was lost, not that it had been misfiled or forgotten in the chaos of a royal household managing decades of sensitive material. It was placed where it was placed deliberately, carefully, by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and exactly what they were hiding. To understand why the discovery of this archive matters so deeply, you first have to understand what Windsor's private document vaults actually are. Most people imagine royal archives as grand, cathedral-like rooms lined with mahogany shelves and gold-stamped leather folders. The reality is considerably less romantic and considerably more deliberate. The private archive at Windsor Castle is a climate-controlled, restricted access facility that houses personal correspondence, private legal documents, handwritten notes, and sealed communications belonging to the royal family stretching back over a century. It is not the royal archives in the formal, institutional sense. It is something more personal than that, more guarded. The kind of place where things go when powerful people need them to disappear without technically destroying them. Access to this facility has always been tightly controlled. Senior courtiers, the monarch's personal legal advisors, and a small number of archivists with decades of service hold the only sanctioned entry. Members of the royal family themselves rarely visit. The work of cataloging, preserving, and occasionally retrieving materials is handled by staff who have spent entire careers operating in conditions of absolute discretion. These are people who understand that what they hold in their hands on any given morning could reshape public understanding of the most scrutinized family in the world. They do not speak about what they see. That is not a guideline. It is the foundational condition of their employment, which is precisely why what happened in January of 2026 was so extraordinary. A small team of archivists had been tasked with a project that had been delayed for years. Following the death of Queen Elizabeth II in September of 2022, palace administrators had commissioned a comprehensive review of all privately held royal documents to determine what should be transferred to the formal royal archives, what should remain in private holding, and what required updated legal classification. It was administrative work, largely unglamorous, the kind of project that produces spreadsheets rather than headlines. The team had been working through the process methodically for months, room by room, cabinet by cabinet, folder by folder. They reached a sealed section of the vault in the 3rd week of January 2026. This section had not been opened since 2001. That date is important. 2001 was 4 years after Diana's death, long enough for the initial storm of grief and public fury to have quieted, long enough for the people managing the palace's narrative to feel confident that certain things could be filed away without immediate consequence. The seal on this section of the archive was not a simple lock. It was a formal legal closure, documented under the signature of a senior royal legal advisor whose name has not been made public, accompanied by a classification notice that designated the contents as restricted pending monarchical review. In plain language, nothing inside could be accessed without the express authorization of the reigning monarch. Queen Elizabeth never authorized that review. In 23 years, she never once directed staff to open that sealed section. Whether that was deliberate or whether it was simply the accumulated weight of a reign filled with more pressing concerns is a question nobody can answer with certainty. What can be said is that by the time the archivist reached it in January of 2026, the section had been sitting undisturbed for longer than some of the staff members had been working at Windsor. When the authorization to open it finally came, it came from King Charles. He had signed off on the full archive review as part of broader administrative reforms being implemented across royal households. There is no indication he knew specifically what was inside that sealed section. People familiar with the process have described it as a routine administrative authorization, the kind of paperwork a working monarch processes without detailed examination. He was not told to expect anything unusual. Nobody was. What the archivists found when they opened the sealed section was a collection of materials that had clearly been organized with intention. There were legal documents. There were several folders of personal correspondence. There were sealed envelopes bearing names written in handwriting that the most senior archivist on the team recognized almost immediately. And then there was the letter. It was contained inside a cream envelope, the kind of heavy quality paper that was consistent with personal stationery used by senior royals in the 1990s. It was sealed with wax. The wax was intact, unbroken. Whatever was inside that envelope had not been read by anyone since the day it was placed in that archive. The outside of the envelope carried 4 words written by hand. The handwriting has since been confirmed by 2 independent document analysts as consistent with letters held in other verified collections. Those 4 words were, "For William, one day." Pause there for a moment, because those 4 words alone tell you something enormous. This was not a letter written in haste. This was not a note dashed off in a moment of emotion and then forgotten. For William, one day. That phrasing describes intention. It describes a woman who sat down knowing she was writing something she did not expect her son to read for years. A woman who was thinking about a future she was not certain she would be part of. A woman who had something specific to say and chose the most permanent way she could find to say it. The archivists followed protocol. They documented the envelope. They photographed it. They flagged it through the appropriate internal channels. Within hours, the matter had been escalated beyond the archive team entirely. By the end of that day, the envelope and its contents had been reviewed by the King's private legal counsel. And by the following morning, a decision had been made that would set in motion one of the most significant private confrontations the modern royal family has ever experienced. William was going to be told. What nobody fully anticipated was what would happen after he read it. Because the letter Diana had written in the months before her death in August of 1997 did not simply express a mother's love for her son. It named names, it made accusations, and it described a pattern of behavior inside the palace that, if accurate, means the people responsible for managing Diana's final years knew considerably more than they ever admitted publicly. Because the contents of that letter are more specific, more devastating, and more consequential than anything you have read in any tabloid. And they raise a question that cannot be unanswered once it has been asked. If Diana knew enough to write this down and seal it away for her son to find one day, what exactly did she know? What Diana wrote, the contents of the letter. Nobody outside a very tight circle has seen the full text of the letter. That needs to be stated clearly and honestly at the outset. What is known has come through sources close to the royal household, people who were either present during the initial review process or who were briefed on the contents in the days that followed the discovery. These are not anonymous internet rumors. These are individuals with documented proximity to the events being described, and what they have shared paints a picture of a woman who was far more clear-eyed about her situation than the palace ever wanted the public to believe. Diana wrote the letter sometime between late 1996 and the summer of 1997. That window matters. By that point in her life, she had already been through the formal separation from Charles in 1992. The divorce had been finalized in August of 1996. She had already given the Panorama interview in November of 1995, the one that shook the monarchy to its foundations and confirmed to the world that the fairy tale had been a carefully managed fiction. By the time she sat down to write this letter, Diana was not a woman in the middle of a crisis. She was a woman on the other side of one, clearer, more resolved, and apparently more afraid than she had ever let on publicly. Sources say the letter opens not with sentiment, but with instruction. Diana was precise about what she wanted William to understand before he read anything else. She told him that what she was about to write was not written in anger and was not written to cause pain. She described it as a record, her word, according to those who have been briefed on the contents, a record of things she had witnessed, things she had been told, and things she had come to understand about the institution she had married into and the people who ran it. That framing is significant. Diana did not write this as a grieving ex-wife settling scores. She wrote it as a witness, someone documenting what she knew because she understood that the people she was describing had the power and the motivation to ensure that version of events never reached the surface. The The first and most striking portion of the letter deals with the period immediately following her separation from Charles. Diana described in specific terms what she called a campaign of managed isolation. She wrote that decisions about her access to royal residences, her security arrangements, and her official schedule were being made not by Charles alone, but by a small group of senior courtiers acting in coordination. She named the roles, though sources have been careful not to confirm whether specific individuals were named by name or by position. What is clear is that Diana believed her movements, her communications, and her access to her own children were being systematically monitored and controlled in ways that went far beyond anything the palace had ever publicly acknowledged. She described one incident in particular that sources say takes up considerable space in the letter. It involves a period in 1995, several months before the Panorama interview, during which Diana believed her private telephone conversations were being recorded and reported back to senior members of the household. This was not paranoia. By 1995, it was already publicly known that Diana's private calls had been intercepted and leaked. The Squidgygate recording from 1992 had already exposed the fact that her private conversations were not private at all. But what Diana described in the letter went further than what had been publicly reported. She wrote that she had been told by someone she trusted inside the household that transcripts of her conversations were being compiled and used to manage what information reached the Queen directly. In other words, the people around the Queen were filtering Diana's reality, ensuring that Elizabeth heard only what they wanted her to hear about her daughter-in-law's state of mind and behavior. If that is accurate, it means the Queen spent years operating on a version of Diana that had been deliberately shaped by the people whose interests were served by keeping the two women apart. The second portion of the letter moves into territory that sources describe as the most emotionally difficult section to read. Diana wrote about her sons. Specifically, she wrote about her fears for William, not William the child, though the tenderness in those passages has been described as extraordinary. She wrote about William the future king. She told him directly that she had spent years watching the institution prepare him for a role while simultaneously ensuring he would never fully understand what that institution had done to the people who challenged it. She wanted him to know the difference between the crown as a symbol and the palace as a machine. Her words, according to sources. She wrote that the machine protected itself first, the family second, and the truth almost never. She also wrote about Charles. Sources have been particularly guarded about this section, and it is not difficult to understand why. What has been confirmed is that Diana did not write about Charles with hatred. Multiple people briefed on the letter have emphasized this point with some consistency. She wrote about him with something closer to clarity. She described their marriage not as a love story that failed, but as an arrangement that was never designed to accommodate a woman who refused to disappear quietly. She wrote that she had come to understand that her role had always been to produce heirs, absorb public affection, and create a version of the royal family that the people would love. When she began to use that public affection for her own voice, she became, in her own words, inconvenient. Then there is the section of the letter that sources say has created the most significant private concern inside the palace today. Diana wrote about what she described as her growing certainty in the months before her death that her life was not fully her own. She did not make explicit accusations of the kind that would translate cleanly into a headline. She was more careful than that. But she described a series of events, conversations, and warnings she had received from people she trusted that had led her to feel that her future was being decided by forces she could not see and could not challenge directly. She told William that she had written the letter and sealed it because she needed him to have a record that existed outside the palace's control. A record that could not be edited, reclassified, or quietly destroyed by the people who had spent years managing her story. She ended the letter with something that sources say is almost unbearable to read in the context of what happened to her 6 months later. She told William she did not know when he would read this. She told him she hoped it would be decades from now, that she would be sitting somewhere watching him become the man she already knew he was capable of being. She told him that whatever happened, whatever version of her story the world had been given, he should know that she saw him clearly, that she loved him without condition, and that she trusted him to do what she never fully managed to do herself. Tell the truth about the place that raised him. The wax seal had been intact for nearly 30 years. William broke it himself, and nothing that came after that moment was going to be simple. William's reaction, the son who finally got answers. There is a particular kind of grief that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with tears in public or collapsed composure at a podium. It arrives quietly, in private, in the moments after something long suspected has finally been confirmed. It settles into a person slowly, the way cold settles into a room when a window has been left open. And according to people close to the royal household, that is precisely the kind of grief that moved through William in the hours after he read his mother's letter. He was informed on the 23rd of January, 2026. The meeting was arranged at short notice and held privately at Adelaide Cottage, the relatively modest Windsor property where William and Catherine have chosen to base their family life away from the formality of larger royal residences. It was not a large gathering. The King's private legal counsel was present. A senior palace administrator attended. Catherine was there. And according to sources familiar with the meeting, Princess Anne had been asked to join, a detail that speaks volumes about how seriously the people managing this situation understood its emotional and institutional weight. Anne had known Diana. She had watched what happened to her from a closer distance than most. Her presence was not ceremonial, it was considered. William was handed the envelope before anyone spoke at length about its contents. Sources say the decision had been made to allow him to read it in the room, rather than receive a summary from legal staff. The people around him understood that whatever was inside that letter, William deserved to encounter it as his mother had intended. Directly. Without an intermediary standing between him and her words. He read it twice. The room was silent both times. What happened after he finished reading is described by sources in terms that are careful and consistent. He did not break down. He did not raise his voice. He sat for a long period without speaking, and the people in the room gave him that time without interruption. When he did speak, his first question was not about the letter's contents. It was about the archive. He wanted to know exactly when the sealed section had been closed. He wanted to know who had authorized the classification. He wanted to know whether anyone had read the letter before it reached him. Those three questions tell you everything about where William's mind went first. Not to grief, not to the personal, devastating weight of reading words his mother had written months before her death. His first instinct was investigative. He wanted to establish a timeline. He wanted to know who knew and when they knew it. He wanted to understand whether the sealing of that archive had been an act of protection or an act of suppression. The answer to his third question, whether anyone had read the letter before him, was confirmed as no. The wax seal had been documented as intact before it was brought to him. Two archivists and the King's legal counsel had all signed documentation, confirming the seal had not been broken prior to William receiving it. That confirmation appears to have provided some measure of relief. The letter had reached him as Diana intended, unread by the people she had written it to warn him about. But the relief was complicated almost immediately by what the letter's existence in that sealed archive implied. Because here is the question that sources say William kept returning to in the days that followed. Not what did Diana write? He knew what she had written. He had read it twice in a silent room, surrounded by people who could not fully share the weight of what he was holding. The question that would not leave him was simpler and in many ways more devastating. Who put it there? Diana had written the letter. Diana had sealed it. But Diana had not filed it in a restricted Windsor archive under a formal legal classification. Diana did not have the authority or the institutional access to do that. Someone else had placed it there, someone with access to the private vault, someone with the seniority to apply a formal legal seal, someone who had decided that this letter, addressed to Diana's own son, should be placed in a location where it could only be retrieved with monarchical authorization. Someone who had decided in 2001, 4 years after Diana's death, that the time had not yet come for William to receive what his mother had left him. That person, or those people, had made a choice. And the choice they made meant that William spent 28 years without access to words his mother had written specifically for him. He was 19 years old when Diana died. He is now in his 40s. He built an entire understanding of his mother, his family, and the institution he is preparing to lead without the information she had deliberately tried to give him. Sources close to the household describe the days following his reading of the letter as a period of intense and focused quiet. William did not make public appearances that were not already committed. He was not publicly visible in the way that has become familiar during periods of royal activity. Those around him describe a man who was processing something enormous with the same controlled discipline that has defined his public life for years, but who was doing so in a way that felt different from previous difficult periods. More internal, more resolute. Catherine's role during this period has been described by sources as essential. She had read the letter herself, with William's knowledge, and people close to the couple say her response was characterized by the same quiet, steady clarity that has defined her approach to every significant challenge the family has faced. She did not attempt to minimize what the letter contained. She did not redirect William toward institutional priorities or public responsibilities as a way of managing the emotional weight. She sat with it alongside him. Sources describe their conversations during those days as long and private, and without any pressure toward resolution or action before William was ready. Princess Anne's presence in the initial meeting also proved consequential in the days that followed. She and William spoke privately on at least 2 occasions after the letter was read. What passed between them has not been shared with sources, but people familiar with both of them note that Anne is one of the very few people alive who has the combination of personal history and institutional knowledge to help William contextualize what Diana had written. Anne was inside that family during the years Diana described. She witnessed the dynamics Diana documented. Whether her private conversations with William confirmed, complicated, or expanded what the letter contained is something only the 2 of them know. What is known is that by the first week of February 2026, William had moved from processing to deciding. The grief had not gone anywhere. That is not how grief of this kind works, and William is not a man who would pretend otherwise. But something had clarified for him, something that people close to him describe as a kind of anchor, a terrible, costly, overdue anchor, but an anchor nonetheless. His mother had seen clearly. She had documented what she saw, she had trusted him with it, and she had been right all those years ago, to believe that one day he would be in a position to do something with what she had left him. The question of what exactly he intended to do with it is one the palace has not answered publicly, but the actions that followed in the weeks after the discovery suggest that William's response has been anything but passive. Because the letter did not only tell him what Diana had experienced, it pointed with considerable specificity toward the people and the systems that had made that experience possible. And William, who has spent years building toward a version of the monarchy defined by accountability and transparency, now had something he had never had before. His mother's own record, in her own words, sealed and preserved and waiting for the moment he was ready to use it. That moment, it appears, has arrived. The palace knew who buried it and why. The sealed section of the Windsor archive did not close itself. That is the starting point for understanding what may be the most uncomfortable dimension of this entire story. A letter written by a princess to her son, placed inside a restricted vault, classified under formal legal seal, and left untouched for nearly 3 decades did not get there by accident. It got there because someone with institutional authority made a deliberate decision to put it there. And that decision, made in 2001, 4 years after Diana's death, was made by people who had read enough of what Diana wrote to understand that it could not be allowed to circulate freely inside the palace. The timeline is the first thing that demands examination. Diana died in August of 1997. The years that immediately followed were among the most turbulent in the modern monarchy's history. The public grief was enormous. The royal family's response to her death had come terrifyingly close to fracturing the public's relationship with the crown entirely. In that environment, a letter written by Diana in her own hand, describing a campaign of managed isolation, documenting her belief that her communications had been monitored and filtered, and telling her son directly that the palace machine protected itself before it protected the truth, was not simply a personal document. It was institutional dynamite. Sources familiar with the archive's history have described a review that began in 1999, 2 years after Diana's death, when a team of senior courtiers and legal advisors conducted an assessment of her personal papers. This review was framed as administrative necessity, but sources now suggest it was also protective. Among the materials reviewed were documents Diana had kept at Kensington Palace. Some were transferred to the formal royal archives. Some were returned to her family, and some were flagged as sensitive in ways that went beyond historical significance. The letter to William fell into that final category. The formal legal seal applied to the archive section in 2001 has been traced to a classification authorized by a senior legal advisor operating within the royal household at that time. Sources with knowledge of the palace's legal structure during that period have described the authorization as something that would have required sign-off from more than one senior figure, which means more than one person inside that palace knew this letter existed. More than one person knew where it was, and more than one person chose, year after year, for nearly 3 decades, to say nothing. The question of why the letter was not destroyed is one that sources have wrestled with, openly. Because if the goal was suppression, destruction would have been the cleaner option. The decision to preserve the letter while restricting access to it suggests something more complicated than simple concealment. It suggests that the people who made this decision understood they were handling something that belonged to William, something that could not, even within the elastic moral framework of palace management, be permanently taken from him. So they filed it, they sealed it, and then they waited, perhaps believing that enough time would pass to blunt its impact. They were wrong about that, because Diana's letter does not only describe events from the 1990s, it describes systems, patterns of behavior that did not end with her death. The courtier culture she documented, the filtering of information, the coordination between senior staff to protect institutional interests over personal ones, these are not ancient relics of a different era. Harry's memoir, published in January of 2023, described remarkably similar dynamics. The filtering of information, the coordination between courtiers to manage narratives, the experience of feeling that the institution's interests were placed above the well-being of the individuals within it. The consistency between what Diana wrote and what Harry described decades later is not something that can be dismissed easily. It suggests the machine Diana identified had continued operating long after she was gone. That continuity is what makes the palace's current situation so uncomfortable. William is not reading his mother's letter as a historical document describing a world that no longer exists. He is reading it as a man who has spent years watching the same dynamics play out around different people with the same fundamental logic underneath. And he is reading it knowing that the people who sealed that letter away from him were not outsiders. They were senior members of the very household he grew up inside. The people who buried that letter believed time was their ally. They believed the distance of decades would soften whatever it contained and diminish whatever consequences it carried. What they did not account for was the possibility that the man who eventually read it would be not just Diana's grieving son, but a future king in the process of dismantling the exact architecture his mother had described. Time, it turns out, was not their ally. It was Diana's. What happens now? The monarchy. William is building in response. Something shifted inside William after he read that letter, and the people closest to him can see it. It is not a dramatic shift. It does not express itself in public statements or press conferences or carefully worded palace communications. It expresses itself in the way William has always expressed his most significant decisions, quietly, deliberately, through actions that only become fully visible when you step back far enough to see the pattern they are forming. The letter did not create William's vision for the monarchy. That vision had been developing for years, shaped by his mother's death, his own experience inside the institution, and his clear-eyed assessment of what the crown needed to become to survive the scrutiny of a generation that no longer extends automatic deference to inherited authority. But the letter gave that vision something it had previously lacked. A personal foundation so unshakable that no courtier, no senior advisor, and no institutional tradition can argue against it. Because it is not William's opinion against the palace's history. It is Diana's testimony against the palace's silence. And Diana's testimony, written in her own hand, sealed in her own wax, and preserved for nearly 30 years in the very vault the palace believed would contain it, is not something anyone inside that building can easily dismiss. William has spoken privately, according to sources, about the concept of institutional memory, about how organizations accumulate not just knowledge, but habits, ways of doing things that outlast the people who created them and persist long after the circumstances that made them necessary have changed. The palace's habit of managing individuals rather than listening to them, of filtering information rather than allowing it to move freely, of protecting the institution's image at the cost of the people inside it. These are not policies anyone ever formally adopted. They are patterns that calcified over decades into something that felt, to the people practicing them, like simply the way things are done. William intends to break that calcification, and the letter has given him both the authority and the urgency to move faster than he might otherwise have felt entitled to. The personnel decisions he has made since inheriting the Duchy of Cornwall are the most visible expression of this intention, bringing in people he trusts personally, people whose loyalty is to him and to the values he has stated openly, rather than to the accumulated traditions of a household culture that predates him by generations. These decisions looked, to outside observers, like the natural housekeeping of a man taking control of a significant estate. They were that. But they were also something more deliberate. William has been building an inner circle defined by one quality above all others. The people around him tell him the truth. That sounds simple. In a royal household, it is revolutionary. Diana's letter described a world in which the truth was managed, filtered, and withheld by the people whose job it was to serve the family. William grew up in that world. He absorbed its rhythms and its silences. He understood, earlier than most people realized, that the warmth directed at him by senior courtiers and household staff was genuine in some cases and entirely transactional in others. What the letter gave him was his mother's own account of what the transactional version looked like from the inside, and that account has made him, sources say, more rigorous than ever about the distinction between people who serve the institution and people who serve the truth. Catherine's expanding role within the palace's operational structure is directly connected to this shift. She has been described by sources as the person William trusts most completely to apply the same standard to every decision they face together. Not what does this protect, not how does this look, but what is actually true and what does the truth require of us. That standard, applied consistently inside an institution that has historically operated on very different terms, is genuinely transformative. And Camilla's resistance to some of William's reform decisions, her continued closeness to figures the palace has been trying to distance itself from, her discomfort with Kate's expanding influence, these tensions are not simply personal friction between family members. They are the visible surface of a much deeper conflict between two completely different understandings of what the monarchy is for. William's understanding, sharpened now by his mother's words, is unambiguous. The monarchy exists to serve, not to manage, not to suppress, not to protect its own image at the expense of the people inside it or the people watching it from outside. It exists to be honest enough to be trusted and accountable enough to deserve that trust. Every decision he makes, every person he brings close, and every person he distances, every reform he pushes through against the resistance of people who prefer the comfort of existing arrangements, is an expression of that understanding. Diana wrote in her letter that she trusted William to do what she never fully managed to do herself, to tell the truth about the place that raised him. He is 43 years old. He is the heir to the British throne. He has just read, for the first time, his mother's own account of what was done to her inside the institution he is preparing to lead. And the people who buried that letter, who made the calculation that silence was safer than truth, are watching him now with the particular anxiety of people who understand that the man holding the evidence is also the man who will one day hold the crown. Diana wrote that letter in the months before her death because she understood that truth, properly documented and carefully preserved, has a patience that power does not. She was right. It waited nearly 30 years, and now it is in the hands of the one person she always intended to have it. What William does next will define not just his reign, but the monarchy's relationship with truth for a generation. The palace that buried Diana's words is about to be led by her son, and he has read every single one of them. Diana wrote this letter alone, in private, trusting that one day her son would find it. She could not have known how long that would take. She could not have known what the world would look like when he finally did. But she knew her son. And she knew, with the quiet certainty of a mother who had seen enough, that he would know exactly what to do.